I want to welcome back Carol Ponton and Matthew Hill to talk about veterans benefits. Matt has written a book on helping veterans get disability benefits, which we discussed in an earlier program. I've asked Carol and Matt back to focus on a particular type of claim for VA benefits, claims resulting from trauma that occurs during service. Now, I know from reading your book that this type of claim is called a claim for PTSD. What does that mean?
Well, PTSD is a mental health condition, and PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. There's certain things it causes. It's typically related to a trauma, and a trauma could be anything from, for our purposes, a veteran serving in combat, or a veteran being assaulted in the service, or a bad car accident.
All right, we see quite a few of those. The PTSD is the combat, but we also see the military sexual trauma. There are a lot of those cases out there that we see, unfortunately.
You know, it seems like we're hearing an awful lot about this lately. Is this something that's been around a long time?
It's been around since there have been wars. I know in World War I they called it shell shock,
Right.
but I don't think they really understood it until the last 30 years, because the VA, even after Vietnam, they didn't recognize it, and they would have all sorts of diagnoses for people, but essentially what they had was PTSD.
Frankly, it wasn't until the early 80s that the psychiatric community picked it up and labeled it, and the VA took them a little bit longer to recognize it as a disability.
How often do you see PTSD in your practice?
We see it all the time. You know, I think the Vietnam veterans came back and they just dealt with it. I mean, some of them couldn't deal with it, but a lot of them just dealt with it by drinking sometimes or by throwing themselves into work. And as they've aged, as they've stopped working, they're just left with the PTSD, the horrors that they visit every night in their nightmares and in their daily life. And I think that's why all of a sudden they've had to deal with it.
And I'd say that it's something where we see, again, we're talking 40 years ago now with the Vietnam era veterans, but those are a big portion of our clients. Carol and I represent veterans as attorneys all over the nation, but we are seeing it with the younger vets as well, unfortunately, coming back. A lot of them are suffering from PTSD.
The things that happened in Iraq and Afghanistan were pretty horrible, and these are young people that have had to deal with things that no one wants to deal with.
Is this a condition that shows up right away, immediately after the traumatic event?
I think it can and it can't. I think some people have a better ability to push things out of their mind for a while, but I think that they do that by either, like I said, some people end up drinking or doing drugs because they can't stand the nightmares, they can't stand the flashbacks, the things that come to them all the time. Other people, they'll work as hard as they can. They'll work all day at work, they'll come home and work at cutting the grass or whatever it is, and when their body doesn't allow them to do those things anymore, they're left with these horrible images that are burned into their minds.
Exactly. We see that a lot, where a veteran will be functional for decades and then they'll retire, and it's almost as if that extra time in retirement is a curse, because it allows them to dwell on these issues, and it becomes more pronounced.
I remember this one client who's the nicest man, and when he came back from Vietnam, he got a job working in one of these storage units way out in the middle of nowhere. And the person that owned the storage unit was an older man who was very kind and gentle, and he worked for him for 30 years. The man died, and he said people would...
The boss died.
Huh? The boss, his boss died. Okay. He worked for him for almost 35 years. And he was able to do this job because he didn't have to deal with people. People would bring their stuff in, leave it, and he basically was alone. So he had PTSD. He didn't even know he had PTSD, but he was able to function. When the older man who owned it died, his younger son came in, and our client could not deal with him. He felt he disrespected him, and he ended up quitting his job and ended up on the street. And this is a man who had worked 30 years, but all of a sudden he was on the street for the problems he had with PTSD. He had no trust, he had instant anger, and it was really sad to see what had happened to him.
So these events could be in the middle of combat, or it could be a sexual assault of some type. It would seem that the traumatic event would be very hard to prove.
Well, you have to take the veteran's word. Remember, there's a presumption of whatever happened in combat, the veteran is able to testify for. But a lot of times with Vietnam, they have a record of when Da Nang was shelled, for instance. and if the veteran can show he was there during the shelling, that would support this stressor. Being in Vietnam and being in Iraq alone during these wars, most of the time they're subjected to incredible things.
Well, and the VA has recognized that. They've changed the law on PTSD in the last several years, in that if the VA concedes that the veteran was in a place where he had fear of hostile military actions against him, I think that's the language they use, then the VA will concede that stressor as long as a VA doctor says that the PTSD is related to that. So it used to be that the veteran had to find all these records showing combat, and then they would
or
provide
buddy
it.
statements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the military sexual trauma, if I could just talk about that, those are much harder cases, because what would usually happen if the person was sexually assaulted? Often it was with people that she worked with, often or many times it was someone who was her superior, and they were in a terrible situation. How do they report their superior to someone else? Who do they report it to? And so you would find they didn't tell anybody. They just dealt with it. So you have to go back and you have to prove it in different ways. A lot of times we show that they asked for a transfer, or that their job, they had been doing an A+ job before this, and all of a sudden they were not doing a job well at all. So they're hard. It's much harder, but it can be proved.
Well, with the MST cases, in addition to there being a problem with reporting, there's a problem of recording. The VA has admitted that these cases are underreported and underrecorded, meaning, as Carol was referring to, a lot of times the victims, male and female, would not report what happened. But even in instances where they did report, they skipped up the chain of command, or they told somebody else, those recordings would never show up. And so there are ways to get around that now, and then showing circumstantial evidence that the veteran can use, but it's much harder to win that claim than it is when a veteran is in combat.
I remember I had this woman, and this had happened 30 years ago, and she had never been able to prove her claim. And I was able to get statements, because if you tell someone at the same time that this occurred of what's going on, you can use those.
Okay.
So I was able to, in talking, she didn't think there was anyone, but in talking with her, she gave me names of different people, and in talking to them, sure enough, she had told them about what happened. And we were able to use that as proof of her claim.
So let's assume a vet can prove that the incident occurred. What happens then?
So the three parts of any VA claim are: a veteran has to have an instance in service, and that's what you were speaking to, proving that; a current disability; and then a link, or a nexus as it's called, between the two. So if the veteran is able to prove that something happened in service, they still have to have a current diagnosed disability, and then once they have that, a doctor has to say, for our purposes, that the PTSD is as likely as not related to what happened in service.
Is this a VA doctor?
Well, going back to what I told you about combat, with combat, with the new regulation where the VA concedes a stressor when the veteran was in a hostile region, if a VA doctor is the one to say that that exposure to the combat was related to PTSD, then there's that link there. But if you have just a regular doctor saying that the stressor is what caused the PTSD, you have to have evidence supporting that stressor. You have to have corroborating evidence, meaning basically secondary evidence, like Carol was talking about, where Da Nang was shelled. You have to actually show that. So there's a difference in the way the VA treats their doctors versus private doctors.
Right.
Now, I've heard about and read about an exam called a C&P exam. What's that?
It's called a compensation and pension exam. So once you've filed a claim, the VA has a duty to assist. And one of the ways they do it is they send you to one of their doctors, normally a VA doctor, and that doctor examines you for whatever claim that you're making, whether it's PTSD or what else. And they first decide, do you have PTSD? And then they would decide, was this PTSD related to what happened to you in the service?
If you've just joined our program, we're here with attorneys Matthew Hill and Carol Ponton, and we're discussing PTSD and VA benefits. Carol, what's been your experience with C&P exams for PTSD claims?
It's all across the board. We have some exams where they diagnose the veteran with PTSD. They seem to be excellent doctors. They take the time with them. And then we have other exams that are pretty sad. The veteran will say, the person spent 5 minutes with me, they wouldn't let me talk, they didn't really ask me anything. So it really depends on the examiner.
So we see, we don't really handle claims where the veteran files the claim. We handle cases where the veteran disagrees with what either the denial of service-connected benefits or the denial of the rating that he wanted. And so we see, unfortunately, some of the worst exams. And
right.
That we see where a veteran was denied. A lot of times we'll see where the VA will say, the examiner will say, well, no, you don't have PTSD, you have a personality disorder. And that will be in the face of the veteran treating at the VA medical center where they're treating him for PTSD. So oftentimes, unfortunately, we see cases where the veteran will be traumatized by the C&P exam because he'll have to relive experiences that he would rather forget about and then have a very poor outcome with his case.
That one of the problems people who have PTSD have is they don't want to relive it. They don't want to talk about it. They are terrifying. Sure. I mean, there's no way to tell you how awful some of these experiences were. And so for them to sit across from a total stranger and start talking about it for the first time in their life, it's very difficult. And so that's one of the reasons I think some of the C&P exams are not very helpful. If a veteran is in treatment with a doctor that they come to feel this doctor feels for me, understands for me, and maybe I can let a little of this horror out and show them, then you get a better result.
What are some of the factors that the VA uses in determining the benefits for PTSD?
You mean the amount of benefits or whether they have PTSD?
The amount.
The amount is they decide how disabled this person is because of PTSD. And they have a rating schedule, and the rating would say if you have these symptoms, then you have a 10% rating. If you have these symptoms, you'd have a 30%.
Okay. So with that, common errors we see with veterans is one of the most powerful symptoms they have are nightmares, flashbacks, and that is something that these veterans live with on a day-to-day basis. And so when a doctor says, well, okay, you have PTSD, what are your problems? That's the first thing they're going to say. And that's a 30% rating, and we see that a lot. What the veteran doesn't immediately identify, but their spouses might, is the anger they have or the isolation they have. So I can't tell you how many times I've talked to a vet where they say, you know, my worst symptom is anger, and then they'll say my worst symptom is the nightmares, the flashbacks, and I'll say, well, how do you do with dumb drivers on the road? And you get these stories about where they run them off the road, they get up, they honk, they get out and fight them, and those are symptoms that the C&P examiner didn't bother looking at, and symptoms that would give the veteran a much higher rating and speak to the severity of the disability more. One
of the real problems with the C&P exams is they won't let the spouses back there. And as Matt said, the veteran doesn't perceive that his anger is a problem. Well, anybody on the other side of it immediately knows it's a problem. Sure. And so they don't get into the things that are really part of this PTSD.
You know, I've heard that a lot of vets with PTSD turn to drugs and alcohol. Does that disqualify them for benefits?
No, in many cases that's part of the symptom. And that's what I was trying to say when we were talking earlier is when a problem happens, when there's a traumatic incident, sometimes the veterans don't seem to have PTSD because they bury it either with drugs or alcohol or work. And it's only when they stop drinking or they stop doing drugs or they stop working that they are overwhelmed with these images that come back to them. I've had a lot of veterans say that if I'm not drunk, totally drunk, I cannot sleep at all. The images are so horrifying.
Now, Carol, I've heard a number of people complain that these vets with PTSD are just feigning this condition to get benefits. What do you see in your practice?
I see nightmares you would never want to have. I see people whose whole lives have been ruined because of what they experienced in the military. I mean, I think you need to know some examples. I have this one guy, he was 18 years old and he was in Iraq, and they were guarding a checkpoint. And this car came toward them and it had blackened windows, so they really couldn't see, and they kept saying, "Stop, stop, stop." The person didn't stop, so they shot them, and then they found out it was a woman with her 3 children. I mean, they're horrible things that happen over and over again. And what happens is this person gets back into society and they keep thinking about what I did. And a car can backfire and it brings them right back to where they were. This is a nightmare.
Yeah,
and we also know that it's real by the way they treat us. It takes a long time for them to have any trust with us. They are quick to anger. And when you talk to their spouses, it's so clear they all have the same problems. And it's just so sad.
It's it's basically being sentenced to a living hell.
It's a life sentence.
Yeah. If you just joined our program, we're here with attorneys Matthew Hill and Carol Ponton, and we're discussing PTSD and VA benefits. Matt, you mentioned the rating formula for deciding a veteran's benefits for PTSD. Could you tell us how that formula works?
Well, the general principle for the rating code is that the veteran should be compensated to the degree to which his disability impairs his work. So the less he can work, the higher his rating should be. With PTSD, it looks at the impairment both from a occupational standpoint, but also from a social isolation. So, 10% is pretty functional. 30%, the biggest complaint is nightmares, flashbacks. 50% you see where a veteran is having trouble with his relationships, not able to maintain relationships, not able to function in a social capacity. Once you get up to 70%, you see veterans who just cannot interact with people, and they have suicidal, homicidal thoughts. And then 100% is complete occupational problem, a complete occupational impairment. And we handle, I'd say almost 80% of our cases have a PTSD component of it. And again, we see time and again where a veteran will come to us, they won't be working, and we'll ask them, they'll say, yeah, I have PTSD, and they'll say, well, what's your worst symptom? And they'll say nightmares. They'll say, I have night terrors and I can't sleep. And we'll say, well, how about anger? And and they'll say, oh, I don't like people much. And we'll say, okay, well, how about, tell me about the last time you had road rage? And they'll say, well, I ran this guy off the road and I beat his head in and he was just dumb. And they can't see their own anger. And
right.
Something that Carol does really well and is getting the statements from the spouse, from the friends, because those people can see what's going on with the individual a lot better, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that I think veterans are denied with their CMP exam. For PTSD, it's not that you just have nightmares. You have to show that you meet a number of different problem areas like hypervigilance or isolation or anger. And so if the veteran is focused on one area and doesn't really want to talk about the other things, then they say he doesn't meet all of the qualifications for PTSD.
Right.
In the CMP exams, they do not allow spouses in, so they're not getting their input. But anger is, I'd say, the key thing they don't realize. This is not normal. This is above and beyond. And they run people off the road. They get in their face. I mean, they'll follow people for miles to get back at them for cutting them off. It's anger beyond anything you've ever thought of.
And just to her point as well on the actual rating, unfortunately, these veterans don't want to talk about this stuff. They don't want to say what happened to them. They don't want to say the current symptoms. So they are going to respond to the questions of the doctor. The doctor's going to ask questions and they'll respond, but if the doctor does not probe, if the doctor does not get into anger issues or list examples, they're not going to do it. And so we see veterans who don't get the rating a lot, and frankly, when we talk to them, it's obvious they should be higher, and it appears that the questions that the examiner had just were not adequate, or they just didn't expand. The veteran didn't.
Okay.
A lot of these veterans don't want to talk about it. What they went through is something even they can't think about again, and they'll just break down and start crying. And so they're not going to sit there with somebody who seems cold and distant and is reading from a form. It's just not going to happen.
Okay, let's say a veteran has depression. That happened in service, and he also has PTSD. Does he get 2 ratings from the rating formula?
Well, he could be service connected for both, but both of those disabilities are rated under the same criteria. So he would be compensated for the highest one. He would not get two separate ratings.
Sometimes the examiners will say, we can't separate these out. They're so intertwined. Mm-hmm. Other times they can say, we can separate these out, and the PTSD should be rated at 50 and the depression at 30. He's only going to get the 50, the higher of the two.
If you just joined our program, we're here with attorneys Matthew Hill and Carol Ponton, and we're discussing PTSD and VA benefits. Matt, let's assume a veteran gets a 70% rating for PTSD, but he keeps getting fired from his job because of anger issues. How does the VA take those types of issues into account?
The anger issues is interesting because that's one of the big hallmarks of PTSD. It's not just anger, it's inability to relate to authority, or just anger at authority, or can't deal with authority figures. So once a veteran is at 70% for PTSD and is not able to maintain employment, that triggers the potential for the veteran getting up to 100% through individual unemployability.
And how does a veteran qualify for individual unemployability?
So in that scenario, the veteran has a 70% rating. There's different metrics when it comes to what the rating the veteran needs, but essentially, at the end of the day, all the veteran has to do is show that his service-connected disability is keeping him from working. It doesn't matter what the rating is. There's different ways to show that he should get unemployability, but the unemployability is basically the VA's way of saying, okay, you can't work, your rating is not 100%, and we will bridge the gap. We will bump you up to 100% due to the fact that you're not working.
Right.
Now, once he has an individual unemployability rating, is that a permanent rating?
No, there is something called permanent and total. So until the veteran is given the unemployability or the 100% scheduler, and they have to make a finding that it's permanent and total. In other words, they don't think it's going to improve. Once they get permanent and total, they don't have to be examined again, and it will say no further exams will be scheduled. Otherwise, say they get unemployability, they're going to get another exam within a year. Have they gone back to work? Have they improved? And until they get permanent and total, that's always going to be a possibility for them.
Now, what does he have to do to keep that unemployability rating?
Well, he can't go back to work.
Okay.
And he has to maintain that degree of severity which keeps him from working.
And he would, they would be prudent to keep going to the doctor and make sure they're having notes in their records that would show the extent to which it affects them. Any discussion of what the veteran's able to do on a daily basis, just so if the VA were to try to reduce the veteran, that he would be prepared with those notes. One thing, though, that the veteran must do on a yearly basis with unemployability, if it's protected at permanent total or not, they have to give a reporting of his earnings for that year. Okay. Even if he hasn't earned anything, they have to send that in.
They get a form once a year. They have to fill it out and say, no, I haven't worked, or yes, I have.
Or the VA can automatically take off that unemployability and reduce them.
Okay.
And one thing I like to point out is that the veteran may be set up once a year for a CMP exam to see if he continues. Well, one of the things the CMP examiners do is they look at their VA treatment records. Mm-hmm. So if the veteran is not getting treatment, I've had a number of examiners say, must be better, he's not getting any treatment. Okay. So not getting treatment goes against them. On the other hand, these veterans they don't want to go in the VA. It reminds them of the military. It just brings all that back. So it's a real struggle for them to go.
Yep.
But we tell them they need to make sure they get some treatment somewhere.
I can see that. Let's talk about ratings in general. Once the VA gives a rating, can they reduce it?
Oh, sure. They can reduce it. Okay. But they have to go through the law. There's a specific way that you must go about in order to reduce benefits once you've gotten them. And there's certain ratings that are protected. So say you have been found service-connected for PTSD. Once that has been in effect for 10 years, they can't get rid of it unless they can show fraud, basically.
I see.
After 20 years, they can't reduce whatever the rating was. So if you have a rating that's at 20%, they cannot lower that after 20 years. There's another protection that comes in after 5 years. And so veterans who have these different years, they need to know there's protection. And if the government tries to reduce, then they've got to go about a specific way. And if they don't do that, it's void. They can get benefits all the way back. Our office had a case where the person had had 100% benefits for 19 and a half years. The VA cut them off in 1980. In 1993, the veteran went back and was put back on 100%, and he came to us to see if we thought this was right. He had been reduced in 1980, but they had not done it in the way that the Congress says you have to do it. And so we were able to go back and get him benefits all the way back from 1980 to 1993 at 100% where they had cut him off.
Okay.
Simply by showing that they did not follow the requirements of reduction. Whenever you're reduced, that's something that someone should really look at, because most of the time the VA does not follow the process they have to. And if they don't, it's void.
So who has the burden of proof in a case like this?
Well, I think the government has to show that they did it correctly.
Right.
They can't just take away the benefits.
Right.
Yeah, they have to show it.
So what would happen if the VA, I think you're talking about due process, what would happen if VA failed to follow due process?
It's void.
It's illegal, and it's illegal, but yeah, it goes back to what she said with that case. I mean, they got to give all the benefits back.
Everything.
Okay.
He didn't have to show anything other than the reduction was not done correctly. He didn't have to show that he was totally disabled back then. It was, you didn't follow the law. So it makes the government do what they're supposed to do.
Okay. Carol, let me ask you this. How long has your firm been representing veterans?
Well, you know, for a long time, they really didn't want, and they still don't want lawyers representing veterans. And I was doing Social Security disability. And because of that, I ran into a lot of people who were disabled, but I could tell they also were entitled to veterans benefits. So I started learning about that system. I couldn't legally represent them, but I would write up their claim, I would send it in, and I would give them advice on how to process their claim, because veterans can often get a lot more money from the VA than they were going to get through Social Security. So I did that until the early 1990s. The VA changed, and they said lawyers can represent a veteran if they're at the court. They created a new court. So we began going to conferences, learning how to represent veterans in the early 1990s. And then they changed the law once again in 2007. And it's so much better because most of the veterans did not know how to get to the court. So they kept running in the same wheel where they were applying, denying, applying, denying. In 2007, the law changed and said, if a veteran has been denied, then we can represent them. And that's when we were really able to get in and help veterans a lot.
Wow. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank you, Carol, and you, Matthew, for coming in today and sharing with our veterans all this fantastic information. Again, the book was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it puts everything a veteran needs to know in quick, concise terms. So thanks again for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
And we'll see you guys next time